Welcome to the Long Thread podcast about spinning, stitching, and weaving by hand. The podcast is presented by Long Thread Media, publishers of Spin-Off, Handwoven, Piecework, and Little Looms magazines. Find us online at longthreadmedia.com. Trinway Silks is where weavers, spinners, knitters, and stitchers find the silk they love. Select from the largest variety of silk spinning fibers, silk yarn, and silk threads and ribbons at trinwaysilks.com. You'll discover a rainbow of colors thoughtfully hand-dyed in Colorado. Love natural? Trinway's array of wild silks provide choices beyond white. If you love silk, you'll love Trinway Silks, where superior quality and customer service are guaranteed. Learning how to weave but need the right shuttle? Hooked on knitting and in search of a lofty yarn? Yarn of Kansas has been your partner in fiber since 1971. Whether you are around the corner from the Yarn Barn of Kansas or around the country, they are truly your local yarn store with an experienced staff to answer all your fiber questions. Visit yarnbarn-ks.com to shop, learn, and explore. I'm your host, Long Thread Media co-founder Ann Marrow. Julia Gomez is a fiber artist specializing in Colcha Embroidery, a technique that is unique to the American Southwest. Julia, thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I would love to learn more about Colcha Embroidery, which I think is such an American kind of an art form. Would you tell me a little bit about it?
Yes, it is. I only do the traditional Colcha embroidery that the explorers did and the people that moved here back in the 1700s. And the women just did it for a short period of time because they already knew how to embroider with fine textiles and fine threads in Spain and in Mexico, where they lived before they moved north. And they didn't come here to embroider. But once they had a little bit of time, which was very little time, they didn't have any thread, any fiber, any textile. And so all they had were the sheep that they brought with them, the Churra sheep from Spain. And they would sit, maybe they would sit in the late evening by the last light of day and embroider. And they chose what in English is the couching stitch, which is a long stitch laid down and then come back and tack it down. And it was a filler. And they would fill up the piece. And they might have done just religious images because they also brought the Catholic religion. And so most of our work are religious items and altar cloths because we believe that that's what they started with. Now, once the Santa Fe Trail opened, then they could trade for finer textiles and finer threads. And it goes back to being a very fine, beautiful embroidery that you do see in Spain, because you're not going to see the Spanish colonial type, which is really thick and coarse because the wool is from the Churra sheep. It's all hand spun and woven, and the background is woven, and then all the colors are natural dyes. And that's all they had. Some people like it. Some people don't like it at all because they like very fine, intricate embroidery, delicate embroidery. But at the time, This is what they did.
So you said it was for a pretty short period. How do you learn about it if it's something that, for a lot of textiles, they don't last very well? So how do you learn about this?
No, they don't. And we have very few remnants that might have been found because it doesn't last. Wool textiles do not weather history at all. But the Spanish were well known for keeping records and writing things down. They didn't write about embroidery, but it's been passed down from generation to generation. Every once in a while, you'll have somebody in the 30s it was revived, and then it was revived just recently. And I've been trying since I learned how to do it. No, since I was in Spanish Market, to start groups all over the state, and it kept going in Colorado, in the San Luis Valley. And so now we have also revived that little group. We have clubs all over New Mexico, from Taos to Las Cruces, Santa Fe, Albuquerque, Espanola.
So if it's really connected to the Churro sheep, I mean, the changes that the Churro sheep has undergone over centuries must have made a big difference as well.
Yes. See, and that's what made me fall in love with it, because I loved the story of the Churro sheep. When the explorers came, Spain, their money was in the merino sheep, which is a really fine, luxurious textile. And they that's what was their industry, the merino sheep in Spain. And so they didn't allow the explorers to bring the merino sheep. They sent what they considered the peasant sheep. The peasant sheep, or the Churro sheep, that have a long fiber, and it's very strong, and it's coarse. But that was the colonists. That was their meat on the hoof, because they brought all the domesticated animals. They brought the horses and the sheep and the pigs and the chickens to this part of the country, and those peasant sheep became the prize sheep here, because they could live just any place. They adapted to the climate. They just could eat any shrub, and they required very little water. So they sustained the colonists. And here they just became the prize sheep, because eventually New Mexico even became a sheep state, because they would shear the sheep and send the sheep to the East Coast, and just bags and bags of wool.
But over time, the Churro sheep has sometimes
Yes.
gotten to be very few and sometimes come
Very
back.
few, very
Mhm.
few, but it's coming back, because they're finding that it's very sustainable to the land. It just kind of walks on the crust. It just doesn't disturb the crust, and they don't destroy the environment. But yes, in New Mexico, you're going to find the Churro sheep. We were very lucky, because at one time there was a lot of sheep, and the Spanish and the Native Americans shared the sheep. And then when the government would come, and if the tribes had too many sheep, they would just slaughter the sheep. And then when they took the natives to Redondo, where they isolated them on top of the mountain, they were smart enough to hide the sheep in the canyons where they lived. So we have that strain. We still have that strain of the Churro. And now there's people like in Santa Maria, in Gallup, and different places where they do have herds and herds of flocks and flocks of sheep, of the Churro sheep. And we have them at El Rancho Las Golondrinas. And that's where I learned all my information, because when I was a home ec teacher, and that was my profession in the junior high. And one day, Monica Sasaya, who was the grand dame of Colcha Embroidery in Santa Fe at that time, was giving a class. So I went. I decided, I don't know anything. I embroider and I do all kinds of things. I didn't know about Colcha Embroidery. So I thought, well, I'm going to go and see what it's all about. And I get a day off from the kids. And I spent the day, and we embroidered, and I really enjoyed it. And I came back, and I did teach my students a little bit of embroidery. And then life goes on, and I had a child, and she was going off to college, and I was getting ready for retirement. And Monica was giving that class again. And one of my friends said, I want to take this class. And I said, well, I already did, but I'll go with you. So I went. A couple of us went together, and we embroidered. And Monica liked my embroidery, and she said, you should be in Spanish Market. Because in Santa Fe, the last weekend of July, we have a beautiful Spanish market with all traditional arts. And so I tried to jury in, but at that time, it was 2000. Beatriz Sandoval from Las Vegas, New Mexico, had woven sabanilla, which people hadn't seen in many, many years. Sabanilla is the background fabric for the embroidery. Actually, during the 1700s, during the colonial period, it was a utilitarian cloth. They used it for everything, for curtains, to make pouches, to move things on the donkeys. It was just a utilitarian textile. But at that time, the men were the weavers, and the women would just kind of collect scraps. And they would take a small piece and then sew it together to make a larger piece and then embroider on the face of it. But they would cover the whole face with embroidery so you couldn't see the ugly background. And that was the type of embroidery that they did, because everything was wool on wool. That's all they had. And then later on, as time went along, once the Santa Fe Trail opened, they stopped doing that type of embroidery, because then they could use cotton and other textiles that were coming in on the Santa Fe Trail. And then it becomes more luxurious and it looks more like other embroidery that people have seen, especially from Spain or from China.
And now a word from our sponsors. Sustainability and regenerative ranching have been a way of life for the ranches of Shaniko Wool Company for decades. They're the first farm group in the U.S. to achieve certification to the rigorous International Responsible Wool Standard and Nativo Regenerative. Shaniko ranches raise merino rambouillet sheep in the western U.S., delivering a fully traceable wool supply that gives back to the earth and its ecosystems. To learn more and discover Shaniko's yarn partners, visit ShanikoWoolCompany.com. Knitters know Manos del Uruguay for their yarn's rich tonal colors, but the story of women's empowerment and community benefit enriches every skein. Discover 17 bases from lace-weight to super bulky, made and dyed at artisan-owned cooperatives in Uruguay. Ask for Manos at your local retailer or visit FairmountFibers.com. And now back to the show. So were they using the same, because one of the wonderful properties of Churra wool is because it has two coats. Were they using the same type of wool for the embroidery that they were using for the background cloth?
Yes, because at that time, everything was very rustic. And at that time, they didn't know about separating it. They just used it as it came off the sheep. And that's what I do. I know the history behind that, and people know that you use the long staple for one thing, and then the soft interior they use for things that are softer. But this was back in the Vigots, back at the beginning, because I think about when I work at Rancho Las Golondrinas, this is what those ladies were going through. They were busy working in the field, tending to the babies, grinding corn to make tortillas. And so they had very little time to be picky or to learn about these different things. And so that's why I enjoy it, because it's the history of the people that came here, and it's also my history. And so I was just very happy to spend my time at the ranch and learn all these different things that the colonists did.
So the ranch, is that kind of a living history museum?
Yes, that's exactly what it is. And we have Churro sheep, registered Churro sheep. And we have about 20, and that's all we can afford to keep, because they need tending and they need food, and it gets to be expensive. So we try to keep about 20. And sometimes we have the rams, and sometimes they're bred and sometimes they're not.
You were mentioning that somebody was weaving the background cloth and people hadn't seen that before, but that's something you do as well.
Yes. And so, and then that's right. When I started going to El Rancho Las Golondrinas with Beatriz Sandoval, I followed her around all summer, and I learned all about the history and the sheep. I fell in love with the sheep. So shearing the sheep is a real macho thing. The men do it. They really don't let the women get involved. But there's kind of what we call women's work. We have to know how to, they shear it. Then we are allowed in the pen, and we go and we roll up the fleece in a certain way. Then we take it to the table where we unroll it, and then we clean off all the messy part, the unusable parts, and get rid of them. Because we have to register them, we weigh them and measure the fleece, and then we use that fleece to demonstrate at the ranch during festivals. We demonstrate we have the children learn how to, we card with the children, and then they make little bracelets, and we dye the wool different colors that we've spent the summer collecting plants. And so it's a lot of fun. At one time, I wanted to do it all. So Beatrice took me up north to Mora, and where this lady lived, and she had maybe 10 sheep, and they were really kind of like her pets. and they followed her around. And she would shear maybe one a day or two a day, depending on her energy. So she said, "Come on, and I'll show you how to shear." Well, she got the lamb and laid it down, and then she gave me the hand shears.
Mm-hmm.
And she was trembling and I was trembling.
Oh.
And so I tried to shear it. And I think I got like kind of one side of her on the back. But I didn't get really close because I was afraid. Anyway, so one time I moved funny and then the sheep jumped and I jumped. And I said, "Okay, I don't want to do this anymore." And I think I'm just going to talk about shearing because I'm just too little and too old to do it myself. I'll leave it to the men. But it was a good experience, and I have pictures, and we'll have a good laugh about it.
Well, when you say you wanted to do it all yourself, I think most people would say that spinning the yarn is enough doing it all yourself.
Yes. And then we learned to wash the fleece with the root of the yucca plant. The Native Americans taught the Spanish to use the local things. And so one of them was to use the root of the yucca plant as soap. And so we do that. And then we wash it, and then we card it, and we spin it, and then we weave it. I weave the background fabric. And there's very few people that do all of it. When I first started, it was really easy because I go to the store. We had a beautiful wool shop, and I could just choose all the different colors that I liked, and it was really nice. But now it's work to spin because I like to spin in the winter because I sit in front of the TV and I spin. And I used to spin in the grease. That means just straight off the sheep. And that makes a lot of debris. And I would put a garbage bag with clothespins on my shoulders, so that if the phone rang, I could get up, take the clothespins off, and drop the garbage bag and get to the phone without taking the debris from one end of the house to the other. My dogs really liked it, and so sometimes I'd spin outside so that they could smell and play at it. But in the house, it didn't work. But good thing I live alone because I can make all the messes that I want. So anyway, I spin the wool, and then I weave it, and I also dye it. We have a great dye shed out at the ranch, and we all take turns learning to dye with the different plants. And it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. The children just love it.
When you are spinning and weaving, what kind of equipment are you using? Are you using a spindle or a spinning wheel?
When I'm at the ranch demonstrating to the children, we use the malacate, which is just a long spindle. And I like to do it in the dirt. A lot of people will put the end in a bowl. And then I just spin the spindle on my thigh. And that's what they carried with them. The men and the women always carried one. They were always spinning. But then to do anything big, then I bought a spinning wheel. And so it's like driving a Cadillac. You can really produce that wool.
Those molcajetes, it's a supported spindle, right? So you can spin something kind of lofty. And I think that's not exactly the same as a Navajo spindle, but similar.
Well, it
idea.
is. It is.
Oh,
It's the Navajo spindle.
Okay.
The malacate. And they can really spin. They can spin faster than I can spin on my spinning wheel. Because I've watched those ladies, and they do beautiful. Mine's very slubby because that's not my forte, is spinning. But I use it anyway. But the Navajos, it's just like silk. It's very thin. They can make it any dimension that they want, and they're very fast.
Yeah. And then are you weaving on a two-shaft loom?
Yes. And I gave up my loom now that I'm older because I live in a very small house. And so I'm not doing any weaving at my house. So if I weave, I'll use the old rickety looms at the ranch, which makes it's just really interesting because it's not perfect and I don't want it to be perfect. I like all the mistakes and the slubs. It gives it more character.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what I enjoy.
And it's a plain weave, but it has a lot of character.
It's a plain, yes, and it's a plain weave. And a lot of women, there's a lot, there could be money in weaving sabanilla because the artists are always looking for it. And it runs like from $50 to $75 a yard.
Wow.
And for maybe 12 inches wide.
Mm-hmm.
Because the weavers, real weavers, don't want to do sabanilla. They want to do patterns and rugs and different colors. But we need just the plain weave and the white or the beige to embroider on.
And are you using the same yarn for embroidery, for the Colcha embroidery, as for the background?
Yes. So if I'm just going to spin for doing the embroidery, I try to get it a little thinner so it's not so thick, but it's slubby and it's okay. Because one of the first things that I did was a cape for La Conquistadora, Our Lady of Peace. She's a statue that the Spanish brought when the artists came. And she's at our cathedral. And it was a custom in Spain to dress their saints. So that custom came to the New World. So as a child, there's a novena that they do every year. And they take Our Lady from the cathedral downtown to the cemetery where she has her own chapel and in procession. And then every day they change her dress. And so my mom and dad used to always take us to the novena. So I continued it when I had a daughter. And I always wanted to make her a dress, but she has beautiful dresses, fine textiles from all over the world. And I thought, well, I'll wait until I get some money to buy something nice. But when I learned to do the embroidery, I was weaving. I remember I was weaving. And the thought came to me that she doesn't have an outfit, a dress from the colonial period when and that was her purpose when she came, was to protect everybody. So I wove sabanilla. I cut out it's called a scapular and a cape out of sabanilla. And then I dyed the yarn with blue and I made flowers along the edge of the gown. And then I used for the scapular, which is like a little apron inside. My very first spinning was really slubby and I had dyed it with indigo. And so I thought, I really like this and I want to use this. And so it's thick and slubby. When I did the scapular, when she's on her altar, which is really high, it stands out and it gave it depth and dimension. And I think it's beautiful. And I made that for her in 2002. That was my first Spanish market. And I have received many, many blessings from that. I was very glad that I did that.
That's a wonderful thing to do with early work. I think a lot of people don't save their early work or feel like there's not something worthwhile to do with it. So to do something that meaningful, I think is really special.
Yeah. And I'm glad I did that because then for that was 2002 when I finally got juried into Spanish market because I had sabanilla and hand-spun yarn and I had done everything. I did this beautiful burial cloth and a lady walked by and I won the blue ribbon. I won the blue ribbon the first year I entered. And a lady from Connecticut walked by and I remember that she was probably like 90 years old and she was on with a cane and she liked the burial cloth and she wanted to buy it. So I start telling her the story, yada, 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 yada. You know, me and my stories. And I go on forever. She said, I don't care. I just like it because it's pretty. Just give me a seat so I can write you a check. And I said, okay. So I did. She wrote the check and we put it in a bag and my friend even walked her to her car to help her carry it. And it was gone to Connecticut, I guess. And so, because that's all I remember on the check when I cashed it. And then later on, somebody said, oh, you're not supposed to do that. All of your prize winners, you're supposed to save for the family. So from then on, I saved them for the family.
Mm-hmm. What a strange thing to say to an artist. I don't care. What an odd thing.
She didn't care about the story. But, I tend to rattle on and then I go off on a little side story and
there's just so much meaning in the stories of traditional handwork. That's all.
Yeah, everybody has their story to tell.
So, in addition to the religious iconography, though, I've seen some, flowers and birds. Where do you get the inspiration for your motifs?
Well, the ladies that came here, they just embroidered what they saw or what they remembered. And I do the same. My friends and I go for our morning walk, and where we walk, which is behind our high school in the fields, there's a lot of wildflowers. And so I'll remember them, or I'll take a picture of them, and I will use them in my embroidery. Also, there's a lot of traditional flowers that the ladies have made up and people have put into books. We have books about Colcha. My biggest complaint is that the people that write books are authors. They do research, and they do beautiful research. But when it comes to instructions for doing the embroidery, they haven't done that. And I can't even do it myself because I tried to write down instructions. I'm a visual learner, and I have to look at things, and I have to do it. I'm very mechanical. If you could show me how to do it, I can do anything. But listening, sometimes I don't understand. And I think that's with people, is that they haven't done the work. And a lot of the research is done by non-Spanish speaking people. And so if you see the word colcha, it only means blanket. And yes, there were a lot of blankets sent to California for the miners. There was a lot of blankets traded between Mexico and the United States. They're called colchas, but that doesn't mean that they were embroidered. And so when I did research, I found that what they called the embroidered blankets was sabanilla labrada. Sabanilla is it's the Spanish word for sheeting, like for linen, bed sheetings. And labrada means worked, decorated. And so that's the word for this art. But, I keep telling people, but it's culture's going to stick. But people that are native speakers, when they come and they see colcha, they think I'm a quilter, that I make quilts.
Mm-hmm.
And, I've been at this business for 40 years old, and I can't find it anymore. So I'll just let them call it colcha. It's okay. I'm done. I do like to say colcha embroidery so that they know it's, and actually in English, it's the couching stitch. The couching stitch is a universal stitch. Every country uses the couching stitch, which is a simple, fast stitch. And they've researched it all the way back to Uzbekistan or Turkestan.
Wow. So, I would imagine that the women who were coming over, that somebody had learned other refined stitching techniques.
Sure.
And then when they were in an environment where they had to do things more quickly, they said, let's get these stitches on.
Yeah. Let's get these stitches on. The light's going to be gone in a minute, and we better be in bed.
And yet I just find it remarkable. You see it over and over again that people who are struggling to survive are still putting energy into making things beautiful. It's such a human thing.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That is true. That is true.
Now, when I've just seen some of your pieces, that there was one in Piecework magazine, but they're not necessarily covered entirely with the embroidery. Is that right?
Yes. When I first started, I always do once a year, I do a piece that is all covered so that we don't lose that tradition. But if you've ever hand spun, shear the sheep, spin the wool, and then weave, that piece is really important to me because it has my spirit. That yarn has gone through my hands many, many times. It has my spirit. And I love the sabanilla as much as I love the images that I put on it. So I don't always cover it because I like for people to see the weaving, as uneven as it is, and it has a little tracking in it. I like that. And so I don't always cover it. I'll do sprinkle flowers or images around it or all over it. I don't always cover it. But there is some beauty in the one that is also always covered. Now, when I cover something, I'm not using my own sabanilla. I'll find another piece of textile that nobody wants to see.
So you mentioned that you've done research on these. Where besides Las Golondrinas have you been able to learn more about it?
I was a docent at the Museum of Spanish Colonial Art for many years.
Mm-hmm.
For about at least 10 years, I was a docent. And when it first started, it was great. We had a wonderful time because it was new, and the docents had to take lessons with all of the Spanish market artists. So we know how to do retablos, which is the painting on wood, because we didn't have canvases at that time. So we learned to do that. We learned how to do jewelry. We learned to do reverse gas painting. We learned to punch tin, which was really interesting. And that, then we had all of this whole library. We still have that whole library to do research. And at Golondrinas, we have an extensive library also.
The museum, is that also in Santa Fe?
Yes, it's up there on Museum Hill. Now it has a new name. It's not the Museum of Spanish Colonial Art. It's called El Museo Nuevo Mexicano, or something like that. But it's always going to be the Museum of Spanish Colonial Art because I can't remember. I reached that age where my words just fly away.
That's really interesting about being a docent. I'm not sure people realize that it's one of those ways that you get so much for yourself in addition to having a volunteer opportunity.
Oh, I know. I could just spend my whole time just learn. I love learning about everything. It doesn't matter. I've always loved school. That's why I was a school teacher. I always wanted to be in school and learning things. And then I chose home ec because the kids love home ec, and I wanted them to want to come to school. Say, well, I better not play hooky today because Miss Gomez is making tortillas and chocolate chip cookies. And, I taught for 36 years. So I'm at voting. I'm voting. And this man comes over. He's dressed in a beautiful suit, and he looks very professional. He says, Miss Gomez, do you remember me? I was one of your students in 7th grade. And so we were talking and laughing, and I thanked him for remembering me. And then there's somebody way back in the line, a tall kid, and I was a man. So man, and he says, Miss Gomez, I was one of your students. You yelled at me because I burned the cookies. And we all had a good laugh. Everybody looked at me, and it was so funny. But that's why I love Santa Fe, and I grew up there, and I taught there for 36 years. So I'm very happy living there.
So you mentioned that you had done embroidery on your own before you took that class. Have you always been interested in textiles and handwork?
Yes. Well, that's part of home ec. When we were little, my mom would make, on Saturday, we would clean the house, help her clean the house, and then she would sit us down and we did a little embroidery. She taught us how to do cotton embroidery, and we embroidered on dish towels and pillowcases and little doilies. I remember doilies. And so, I always knew how to embroider. But then I didn't use it much later on when I became a teacher and a mother. But every once in a while in home ec, I always wanted the boys and girls to learn how to use a needle and thread. And so we would do a little pincushion with embroidery. And then when I heard about the traditional Colcha embroidery, that caught my attention. And that's why I went to that class. And then once I retired, I had another career. And so I still teach at the Museum of Spanish Colonial Art once a month. And I have a group about 20 ladies. Sometimes it's 10, sometimes it's 5, sometimes it's more, because everybody has something to do. And I keep it going. And then during the season at El Rancho Las Golondrinas, I embroider. I sit there and embroider and talk to the tourists, talk to the children. And
you must have taught hundreds of people how to do this.
Yes, I hope so. And I hope they continue, because even people that are traveling through, like I have a lady that travels through, she comes here in the summer. And when she's here in the summer, she comes, or if she's coming to visit somebody, she'll stop by and talk Colcha Embroidery, and we'll work at that. And Florida, people from Florida, I have a friend in Texas. So I'm hoping that they all continue and they spread it around. And I've traveled because of my embroidery. I was invited to the Embroiderers Guild convention in Miami. So my daughter helped me and we went there. And I went to Indianapolis. I've done it in California, in Texas. And then in China, I went at the expense of the Chinese government 5 times to demonstrate my embroidery, which was fun because the Chinese, they love the Americans and they just want to take pictures with us.
Yes.
The embroidery, they were not interested in all because to them, the Colcha embroidery is like a peasant thing because of the sheep. Because of course they do silk, and we had the best time because the ladies would come and they would see the needle, and our needle's thick, it's a big needle. And I said to my friend Annette, this lady is looking at the needle. Let's give it to her. She probably thinks it's a nail, and compared to their needle. Let's give her the needle, wrap it up and give it to her so she can take it. So she can take it and show it to her friends, and they'll probably just laugh at us because it looks like a nail to them. Because they do that beautiful embroidery, silk on silk with silk. The needle is so thin, I can't even see it. I have bad eyesight. And the thread, because they also demonstrate next to us as we're demonstrating. But they do, and so they really didn't like. And then I talked to them about our history and how old we were. In Santa Fe, we were 400 years old, and they would, China's thousands of years old.
Yeah.
But anyway, they were always very gracious to us and always wanting to give us presents. Very nice people.
It's interesting. I think that the view of the settlers and explorers and colonial people in the Americas has kind of changed over the years. That it used to be very much focused on the explorers, and now I think there's a lot of focus on the Native Americans as well.
Yes, and I think there's a lot of focus on reconciliation because yes, it was a very bad time, and I'm very sorry for everything that happened, but we have to learn to live together. I have 36% Native American. And so, my mama grew up in Colcha, New Mexico. And she said, we always got along with the Pueblo, and they were always very good to us. We were very poor, and we just helped each other. And that's the way it should be. We should always help each other. We have to learn to get along. This generation, I'm hoping that they will forgive and reconcile and let us be friends and take care of each other because we're at a point where we need each other.
One of the wonderful things about embroidery and stitching and the living history element of it is making connections with people as opposed to movements.
Yes.
So I think probably the least favorite question of any embroiderer is, what do you do with it? So you've mentioned that you had a burial cloth and that you created a piece for the saint, but is this purely expression now, or are you using the Colcha embroidery as part of something?
Well, for both. You can hang it on the wall. I like to have it framed in tin because that's another Spanish colonial art, and it looks beautiful in tin. And a lot of there's 2 tinsmiths in market, and they've both learned to do colcha because it really is pretty together. And nowadays, we used to always have little table mats, little doilies on furniture. People aren't doing that anymore. But I do make a few table runners that are very pretty. And I just made a small one. I was invited by one of the Smithsonian galleries to do an exhibit in 2025. And the lady had seen a piece that I did with butterflies, and she requested butterflies. So I did butterflies of New Mexico.
Oh.
And so I'm going to send it to her now in January, and then there'll be an exhibit. So I hope we all get to go.
Do you know what month the exhibit is scheduled to be?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
Well, because she told me I had to have it done by October the 31st. So I worked at that, and it's done. And I sent pictures. So she's very happy in the pictures with the pictures, and hopefully she'll put them in the catalog. And then she'll let me know when and how to mail it to her. So that's what I just finished working on. Now I'm working on a commission for La Fonda Hotel,
Mm-hmm.
the end of the Santa Fe Trail.
Yeah.
They commissioned me to do a piece so that they can hang it in the hotel, because they still give tours, and they have put in new carpet all over the upstairs that has like Colcha designs. And so
That's a beautiful
they want
hotel.
one of my pieces. Yeah. So I'm excited about that. And then we finished the Arts Commission in Santa Fe, asked me and my friend Barbara to do a cultural exchange. So we got the sabanilla, and it's 20 by 20. And she wanted us to do just like half of our embroidery, and then she was going to take it to Cuba so they could do their half. And I said, well, I think it would be a prettier art piece if I did my embroidery on the outside, and then Cuba could do theirs in the center. And then I asked Barbara to do the opposite, put hers in the center, and then her lady could do it around the edges. And we did. And then they were doing the same thing in Cuba. And then somebody took them and they exchanged them. So we completed 2 pieces, 2 for Santa Fe and 2 for Trinidad, Cuba.
Wow.
So in October, when the hurricane and the earthquake came, we were right in the middle. We traveled to Cuba so we could meet the ladies that did the embroidery and to take their pieces back to them. And we couldn't get to Trinidad because the electricity was out, but they came to Havana, and we stayed in Havana, and we exchanged the pieces, and we got to meet the ladies. So it was a lot of fun. And then we had to leave. The hurricane was due to arrive in Havana on a Tuesday, and we had to change our tickets to leave on Monday. And as hurricanes do, we left, and the hurricane just turned around and went someplace else.
Yeah. Mm.
But it's all right. We had a wonderful time in Cuba.
It's interesting that you have an art form that's so based in where you are from. And of course, it seems like you have such a strong connection to Santa Fe and where you're from. And that has connected you with folks all over the United States, but all over the world.
Yes, it has. And I hope it continues, because once you leave Santa Fe, you don't hear of Colcha Embroidery. So it's kind of nice that I've been able to travel different places. And people that, like the Embroiders Guild of America, and there's Las Tejedoras in Santa Fe, and there's a lot of different hand fiber arts. There's a lot of interest in different handworks. So I hope that they remember Colcha and it doesn't die. There's, like in San Luis Valley, when they started it, there was a lady, Macaulay was her last name. She wrote a story about the San Luis Valley and the ladies that were keeping the history of their little village in embroidery. It wasn't Colcha embroidery, some of it's Colcha, but it's all different types of embroidery. I went to do a presentation there, and I said, well, I can't teach you anything because crewel embroidery, which has 29 stitches. I said, I only do 1 stitch. Anyway, they all learned it, and we had a lot of fun, and they're continuing their embroidery.
So, Julia, I know that people could come to Las Golondrinas when it's open and meet you, but if folks wanted to see your work, where could they see that?
They can see it at El Rancho Las Golondrinas. They can also see it at the Museum of Spanish Colonial Art, which is now called El Museo de Nuevo Mexico. It's not always on display, but the archives they have my collection. I have some at the Folk Art Museum in Santa Fe, in Colorado at the Museum of Denver, in the Southwest History. I have a piece. But if you go to YouTube and you type in my name, Julia Gomez, Colcha Embroidery, they have all kinds of videos of me. And then Pinterest. I don't understand Pinterest. I'm an old lady, but I'll tell you that Pinterest has a lot of my work on display. They have pictures that I don't even have, and nobody ever asks me if they could take pictures. I mean, I don't mind, and it is kind of nice to go to Pinterest and see my own work.
That is the trouble with Pinterest. You get to see a lot, but they don't always ask people who do the work.
Yeah, but it's okay because they're very pretty pictures, and they do have my name, so I guess it's okay.
Good.
And everybody asks me, and if somebody wants to take pictures, I always say yes. And if they say, can I copy your pattern? And I said, well, it's not my pattern, but you're welcome to copy it.
And you wrote articles for Spin-Off and Piecework for us.
Yes, so I loved it. I was so excited. Yes, Piecework and Spin-Off.
Yes,
that was quite an honor.
We were really excited to have it too.
Yeah.
I'll link to those.
It was a lot of fun, and everybody was very nice, and I really enjoyed it. And thank you, because I'm just so proud to have my name and my face in the magazine.
It was our honor. Well, Julia, thank you so much for your time, and I am so looking forward to making it down to Santa Fe and seeing you demonstrate.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks to our sponsors for supporting the podcast. Thank you for listening to the Long Thread Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate the show and leave us a comment on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks again.